Nicky Deathstalker here. So another very overcast and cold fall/autumn day here. Just for the record, it is 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Up here I'll put what it actually is in centigrade. I'm pretty certain that the MotoGP guys who were racing in Malaysia this weekend, who were in temperature up to 100, would like to see if we could combine our two temperatures and divide them by 2, and we each have a pleasant day, because it was hot, but it's always hot there. And it was a pretty darn good race. Qualifying was even more interesting. The Yamahas, and that was all 4 Yamahas, looked like they were going to be a first to 4th overall in the finish, because they were just heads and tails above everybody else in outright lap times. In fact, Fabio Quartararo set the all-time lap record now on that circuit, which was pretty impressive. And other than a few bobbles where he lost the front end a little bit, but he never crashed. He actually looked like he was possibly on his way to a win. Now, Maverick Vinales on the factory Yamaha was also on a tear, and in qualifying he actually beat Fabio. No, actually, no, he didn't. It was Fabio, I think, had the pole. The race was early in the morning. My brain's still not quite caught up. I'll put up here who had the pole. Now, the interesting thing about qualifying was Marc Márquez. He was the only Honda that was really competitive, and he was the first to admit that things weren't looking good. And he went out in qualifying 2, actually following Fabio, and he was looking for someone to follow to see if he could get a fast lap, because apparently his bike, if it was by itself, was not going to produce a fast time. So he needed to follow somebody to get his fast time, and it just happened to be Fabio. And Fabio didn't really want him to follow him, but then he knew he had to step it up to get a fast lap to make the front row. So he started stepping up the pace, and Mark started stepping up the pace, and then Mark was coming to the one corner and just started to lean the bike over on the left hand side, and Mark was introduced to Mr. Highside, and it was a nasty one. It was nearly as bad as Benito Petrucci's one from Phillip Island. He got spit off the bike, and it looked like he was there holding his rider position in midair. That's how quickly the bike just got rid of him. And he hit the ground on his elbows and hands, and a bit of a face plant too. Like, it was a really hard hit. And that was basically it for him qualifying. And he ended up qualifying 11th on the grid, which I think was the 4th row. Now, he got checked out, and apparently the doctor said Mark is made of steel. I think it's actually more made of rubber, because other than some bruises and scrapes on his elbows and knees, he looked like someone who just slid on a carpet and got a little bit of rug burn. And other than that, he was fine, and Sunday he came out absolutely no problem. Now, unfortunately, on Saturday they had the Asian Talent Cup, which is a sort of a feeder series for Moto3, where they have riders in Asia all competing on identical bikes, and any of the top riders have a chance of moving on to being picked up by a Moto3 team. And in fact, a couple of the current Moto3 and Moto2 riders competed in the Asian Cup, and unfortunately one of the riders, who was actually pretty close to a top rider, he's had a number of wins and was well known and had met most of the MotoGP guys, was involved in a crash, and unfortunately he died. Now, I'm not going to pronounce his name because I don't want to butcher it. I'll put his name up here in his picture. MotoGP and of course all the riders paid tribute to the guy. He was well liked, just an all-around great guy. It's unfortunate this happens. It's one of the things that does happen in racing, but not as much as it used to, but it's still something that most people don't want to see happen. So the next day we're in for the Moto 3 race, and or sorry, make that the MotoGP race. And you know, you have the guys in the front row, and Marc and Dovey were, I believe, 10th and 11th in the qualifying, so they were both back on the same row. So they had the start, and much to everyone's surprise, Marc and Dovey were actually in the front group going into the first turn. In fact, Dovey was ahead of Marc. That Ducati is absolutely incredible off the line for the starts, especially with that start mechanism they use for the Ducatis. That's works really well. So Maverick quickly got into the front after a very short tussle with Jack Miller, and he was gone. Marc didn't waste too much time, but he got caught up behind Jack Miller, and he had to follow him for several laps. The Ducati, of course, having a higher top speed than the Honda, and Jack Miller being an absolute demon on the brakes, made it extremely difficult for Marc to get by. So Marc eventually did get by Jack, and I think Jack, I haven't seen what Jack had to say because this is so early after the race. He either used up his tires or the settings weren't quite right, and he started to drift backwards. And Dovey very quickly caught him and passed him, and Rossi and so forth. Well, then you had Maverick out in the lead by about 1.5 seconds, Marc behind him, and Dovey behind Marc, but slowly falling behind. And then we had a real battle, and that battle was going on between Valentino Rossi and Dovey. They were going at it back and forth. Rossi was trying, it was actually nice to see him actually able to you know, be competitive after so many races this season where he just, the Yamaha wasn't working, but at this track it apparently was. And they fought right up to the almost end of the race. Dovey got ahead of him maybe about the last lap and had put a bit of a distance between him, and Rossi just wasn't going to be able to catch him, but Rossi was probably under a second behind. Now Fabio, who was you know, on the front row and was blindingly fast all through practice, something just wasn't right with his Yamaha, and he just was not competitive at all. He just was behind and just wasn't going anywhere, which was a shame because he seemed to be so fast in qualifying and practice. Surprisingly, Frank Morbidelli, who's Fabio's teammate, who generally finishes behind Fabio, had very little difficulty in getting in front of him and more or less staying there all the time, and he actually finished ahead of Fabio. Now Johan Zarco, who was fitting in for Tadej Seiko, or I always get the name wrong, I'll just put it up here, who's just had his successful shoulder operation, was doing very well on the LCR Honda, and was in quite a battle fighting with Jack Miller. And while him and Jack were fighting, just to see here, John Muir, who races for Suzuki, came by and decided to pass Zarco, and they actually came together and collided, and Zarco ended up crashing out. Now, I did watch the interviews between the two of them, and Joan Mir was saying, oh, it wasn't his fault, and I'm going as someone who raced, oh yes it was your fault. Like, you went into a spot that wasn't wide enough for a motorcycle, and the guy who was there went down, it makes it your fault. So anyways, that's something that'll, in a couple weeks, it'll be probably settled or whatnot. But it was just yeah, Cal Crutchlow ended up crashing out. You know, he had a good race and fell by them, but unfortunately it just wasn't there. The track in Malaysia, it's known for having poor grip. It was kind of weird. They had reasonably good traction on Friday and Saturday, and when Sunday's race came along, they just, all the settings they had for the previous 2 days didn't work. So they basically fought with a lot of spinning and whatnot. Now the interesting thing was, again, for I think this is now the third time this season, Marc Márquez ran out of gas. At least this time it was as he was actually in the pits, just heading into the Parc Fermé for the winners. And Maverick Vinales, who was celebrating, slowed down to give Marc a tow. So that was actually nice of him. Maverick won the race hands down. Marc, you know, said like just absolutely he had nothing for him. The last 4 or 5 laps, his rear tire was just spinning down the straightaways. It was all used up, so there was nothing he could do. And you know, Maverick deserved every bit of that win. And overall, it was a pretty good race. They now have finished their flyaways, and they are off for the next week, and then the week after that they are back for Valencia for the final race. Now, as a side note here, Marc's brother Alex won the Moto2 championship this weekend, and he is now the only winner of the Moto3 and Moto2 championship. Marc won both, but Marc, when he was racing, it was the 125 class. Moto2 is, you know, it's about the same performance level, but different style motorcycles now. So Alex actually going to go down in history for that. And again, this is another year where Alex and Marc both won their championships. So that's another marker in history. And Marc also set the history for the most points collected in the season. So overall, it was a very good weekend. Except for the tragic loss of the Asian Cup rider, it was you know, something to remember in a positive light. So anyways, see you in 2 more weeks. Hopefully I can still ride my motorcycle, because it is flipping cold here today. So hope you enjoyed this. DeathsStalker signing off.